Hello! Thank you for joining me for my little series, Q and Alice. The question today is from a patient of mine who has reached out on Instagram with exciting news of the impending birth of her first baby from her IVF cycle last year. She tells me that she would love to hear about the process of thawing frozen embryos, as she has a few embryos frozen in preparation for a second baby. So thank you, Semi, for the question, and I'm so excited for you. Good luck next week. So when we plan a frozen embryo IVF cycle, we will thaw the embryo on the day of the transfer procedure. At the time of transfer, I may tell my patients about their thawed embryo. For example, I may say something like, I'm transferring a beautiful 5AA embryo with 90% survival and is fully expanded. Now this probably doesn't mean much to most of you, and so I will now explain the process of thawing and what all this means. In current day IVF, overwhelming majority of the embryos are frozen through a process called vitrification, which means rapid freezing. While the embryo is being frozen, the water content is drawn out of the cells and the embryo collapses down. We will thaw the collapsed embryo on the day of the planned transfer procedure, and the first step in thawing is to bring the temperature back up. And the laboratory do this within around 20 to 40 minutes. Then the laboratory scientists can assess under the microscope the percentage of cells in the embryo that has survived the thawing process. If less than 50% of the cells survive the thawing, so what that means is more than half the cells did not survive, then we know that the embryo will not have a pregnancy potential, and we will call it a failed thaw. Now, more than 95% of our embryos will survive the thawing, and less than 5% are lost in failed thaws. If the embryo unfortunately fails to thaw, the laboratory will thaw the next embryo, if there are any more, so the transfer can still go ahead. After that, the embryo will be rested in the ideal temperature and gas concentrations in the laboratory. And what the scientists would like to see in the following few hours is the water contents coming back into the cells of the embryo so that the collapsed embryo will start to plump up, and that's called expansion. Now, expansion is a good sign because it tells us that the embryo not only survived the thawing process, but it's still undergoing a dynamic process and changing in appearance. Sometimes the embryo can still be collapsed at the time of transfer, and that is fine because the embryo may just not have had enough time to expand and may do so later in the day after it is back in the uterus. So, getting back to my embryo transfer scenario that I talked about at the beginning, I'm in the embryo transfer room, and after a careful triple ID check with the scientist, my patient, and an electronic backup ID check to confirm we have the right embryo for the right lady, I tell my patient, we have a beautiful 5AA embryo with 90% survival and is fully expanded. So the first part is 5AA. That's the baseline grading of the embryo. And you can check out my YouTube channel or previous post for my video explaining the grading system of the embryo if you're not familiar with that. And the grading would have been allocated to the embryo before the freezing process. The next part, 90% survival, means 90% of the cells has survived the thawing process intact, which is very good. And finally, fully expanded means the water content has returned into the cells and the embryo is now fully plumped up. All these factors put together can all help us predict the pregnancy potential of that embryo. So I hope you found that useful, and thank you for listening. If you like my Q and Alice series, I would love to hear from you with your questions. You can look out for my Instagram stories on the weekends with Q boxes where you can send me your questions. Bye.